the of cars today. Both of us would far rather than a few analog controls and leave the rest to us, like the shifting and so forth. But this time, last spring, I was with him for a road rally around Denver. And we got to try this car out, and it seemed absolutely brand new. It was, well, I better stop or this is, I'm sure, part of the program. I'm sure it'll be fun and interesting. And once again, Norm Kerr. Thank you, Norm. Thanks, Brad. We'll tie in the audio.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So let me see if I can figure out how to share the screen here. Hopefully this works. Can you see the screen okay?
Yes.
You got it.
Okay, so that's the Ford Maverick Bud was talking about. And this is probably 1979. And yeah, so I bought a wrecked Comet that had a manual transmission and big V8 drum brakes, and I put those onto the Maverick, changing it from an automatic to a manual. And this was my first project working on a car. Did that in high school, and that was the daily driver. And anyone who remembers the Maverick, the Pinto, the Vega, or any Japanese car made in the early 70s, they just dissolved in road salt. This car was 8 years old, and it had massive perforations everywhere. And that was, as you will recall, that was pretty common back then. So the title of my presentation today was not my choice. Somebody else called it Sports Cars, exclamation mark. So I thought I would start with a video. Hopefully you can see this on my screen here, of a pretty exciting exotic car. All right. So, all right. So just a little introduction about myself here through cars. Let me see if I can hit to the next page. How do I do this? Move that out of the way. There we go. Okay. So the next car I restored was a 74 MG Midget. I got this at a junkyard. It didn't run. It was about to be scrapped. Actually, they had already written numbers on the panels. They were going to part it out. And then you can see it definitely needed some body work. I'm not a body worker or a painter. I do mechanical work. So I found a really good metalworking guy to do this work with me. And here it is on its way to the paint shop after all these panels had been repaired and replaced. And then here it is after the painter, me putting it back together. I actually restored this car 2 times. Once in '91 when I first got it mechanically, and then in 2010 after doing the new paint job after the rust had gotten so bad. I did it a second time, and this time it was mostly all cosmetic. Here's the underside. Doesn't look like a 74 Midget anymore. It looks brand new. Super glad with how it turned out. Okay, so that's just like, these are some of the cars I've worked on over the years. The thing that I wanted to emphasize today, oh, here's my Mini that I have also. So I have an MG Midget and an Austin Mini. They both have the same engine. One goes crosswise, the other goes fore aft. The Midget was launched 1 year before the Mini, and they are worlds apart when it comes to suspension, which is fun to drive them because they start from so near the same place. And this is a rear view of it. So you might have noticed, if you've been to England, you've seen these learners permits on the hood. These cars were generally pretty cheap, so people would have those as their car they were learning. In Japan, the learner's permit is a little spring bud like that. And then for elderly drivers, it's in autumn colors. This is a place called The Warehouse in Ypsilanti, the town next to where I live in Ann Arbor. And if you're familiar with Automobile Magazine, David E. Davis was here quite often before he passed away. And people would come here to talk, kind of like your City Club. We had Bob Lutz come one time. Phil Llewellyn came. The American Model A Club came. People drove as far away as from Texas in Model A's, which was ridiculous. So this is just the first Saturday of each month. And in front of me is a Bentley. Over here is a Volvo PV544. There's a MGB. Behind me was a Draco-bodied Ferrari. And anyway, so it's fun to go there and just shoot the breeze with fellow car nuts. And then there's me driving it. This is not an English license plate. If you remember, the very last Rover sold in the US was called the Rover Sterling. And the model number was 827 SLI. And this was a promotional license plate the dealers had. And I managed to get a hold of one of them. And then there's my screensaver. I like this. This is another Mini, but it's not mine. It's a proper Cooper S. Okay, so the reason why I showed you those things was to give you some background on the latest project that I finished. So it's a, let's see if I can show my cursor here. Can you see my cursor on the screen? Okay. So speaking of how bad cars rusted back in the 70s, in contrast, this had about the same amount of rust as the Ford Maverick, but was not 8 years old. It was 25 years old when I took this picture. And I had it since it was new. I bought it, I drove it off the dealer's lot in October of 92. And it was a manual transmission V6 Camry that was good enough. So I just kept driving it. And after it got this rusty, I realized it was time to finally admit it was time for a new car. And looked everywhere, drove a bunch of them and decided I hated everything that was new. Like Bud said, I like a few analog controls and that's good enough for me. Plus, this is a manual and those are very rare these days. So I decided, I did some research and I figured I could probably restore this cheaper than buying a new Camry. So I found a donor car, a completely rust-free car in Spokane, Washington, and bought it off the internet, had it shipped to my house, and then stripped it to a bare shell. Here it is after I had stripped it to a bare shell. And what I did was and it had about the same miles as my car. Mine had 210,000. This one had 180,000. Before I painted the body shell, oh, here's the plate that it came with. The spot welds on a production car, there's a certain minimum pitch that they can be welded at for mass production. What Toyota and Audi and a lot of other car companies have started doing is they add spot welds in between using other processes to make the cabin more rigid. And so I just went around manually and drilled a new spot weld and made puddle welds in between every one of them. Came out to about 800 welds added to the body. And it's funny when you drive it, you can really feel the difference. It really is more together, I guess the car feels. And then rebuilt everything and put it all back together again. And here's the engine out of my car, the engine out of the donor car, both the same model of V6. Mine was manual and it was automatic. And then so rebuilding all the subsystems was pretty straightforward. Toyota makes a kit for each one of these and it's really low cost and really rewarding because the parts had held up so well. Just new bushing, gaskets, seals, and bearings. But then I ceramic coated some of the parts to make them last longer. And this was amazing. After 25 years of use, all I had to do was put new seals in things or de-rust it and repaint it. So here's the subframe all cleaned up. Everything, this is like my front end kit all ready to go here. Fuel tank, mine was all rusted out, but the parts car one was good as new. So rebuilt that and painted it. And then all the pipes that go from the front to the rear of the car, the donor car provided me rust-free ones. Mine were all rusted out. Rebuilt the heating and ventilation air conditioning unit. As you can see, I set up a big workbench and laid it all out. When I did this, I changed to the latest R134 refrigerant. So I had to swap the whole system over. And it was hilarious how long it took me to figure out what to do. It literally took me months to do it. And luckily, I work at Toyota. One of my coworkers is the air conditioning expert for Toyota in North America. So he helped me through a couple of questions that I had. This year of Camry had a hydraulic fan motor, so it could actually change its speed, and it made really, really small amount of noise. And then the pedal assemblies, rebuilt those, repainted them, new bearings, new springs. And the model of Camry is a sports edition, and it did have unique springs and bushings and things. And in several cases, it was apparent that when I bought the part to replace what I had that was all rusted out, I was getting the very last ones that were left in the world. At first, I was just going to clean up the transmission and reuse it, but I realized I had to rebuild it. So I'll get to that in a minute. The steering rack was only used for 2 years. It was a quick ratio rack, which helps make the car feel more sporting. It's funny, rebuilding the engine, rebuilding the transmission, even the HVAC unit was easy compared to the steering rack, because they weren't made to be rebuildable. So you actually have to fabricate your own tools to do it. But I was able to do that and have a brand new steering rack when I was done. Power steering pump, like I said, that radiator fan is a hydraulic fan. So the power steering pump is actually 2 pumps, one for the power steering and one is just a pump to drive the fan. And once again, the kit was inexpensive and very straightforward to rebuild. I made a dolly and sent the body shell out for paint. And while that was off being painted, then I started stripping down my old car and rebuilding what else needed to be used. And then when the body shell came back from paint, put it all back together again. And by this time, COVID had started, so I could do this work at home in between meetings at work and things like that. Rebuilding the suspension was fairly straightforward. I'd done work on it before, with 200,000 miles. These bushings have worn out once before on me, but this time it was like working on a brand new car, which was really, really rewarding. Made a bunch of whole new hydraulic lines because the ones I had rusted out, and the manual transmission ones were not available anywhere. The donor car had ABS, which I didn't want, so I couldn't use any of its pipes. But once you get the tools and you learn the knack, actually making these pipes is pretty straightforward. You just copy the old one. And then unfortunately the body is black, so you can't see very much, but there's the HVAC module going in and the wire harness going in, and then building it up, putting in the impact beam, putting on the instrument panel, and then the steering column. And it's funny how you go from all this spare room that you have to work on to suddenly it gets crowded again once you're putting it back together. I was able to do this by taking tons of photos and notes. Anyone who's rebuilt or restored a car before knows those are the most important part of the project, to keep track of what's going on. And Bud mentioned the mirrors. So when I had first got this car, I had come up with a pair of European spec curved glass mirrors for both sides, which makes the blind spot almost nothing. American cars have to, by law, use a flat glass on the driver's side, which creates a huge blind spot. And in spite of a lot of efforts being made by people like J.D. Power and Consumer Reports and SAE, the federal government has never changed the law. They still require a flat glass on the driver's side, which leads to a lot of lane change and merging accidents because people don't turn their head and make sure that there's nothing in their blind spot. So I loved having these curved glass on both sides, and they had a heater, which this model year of Camry never had, and they were folding, which this era of Camrys never had. And I had broken one of these mirrors the last winter I was driving my old beater before I took it off the road to start this project. And I thought there was no way I was ever going to find another pair of these. And after a year of searching, I found a new pair of them in a warehouse in Emirates. And It was one of those websites where you place an order and it doesn't give you any feedback at all. And you have to wait like a week to find out if the order went through. And a week later, I'm thinking, geez, I ought to email these guys and ask them, did my order, did you receive it? And on my porch from the mailman, there was a UAE postmarked box. And sure enough, a pair brand new of these mirrors for me. So I was super happy. They're the wrong color, so I had to strip them down to the bare parts, paint them, and then put them back together again. And then I ran my own wires to power the heaters. Anyway, that was just an example of the challenge of rebuilding a car like this with parts that are becoming scarce around the world. I did go back to them later and asked if I could get any more, and they said, nope, you got the last ones. Here's the engine room once it was all ready for the engine and transmission to go back in. This kind of sat like this for a little while. Once I had all this work done, I then set myself to rebuilding, rebuilding the engine and transmission. I'll get to that in a second. I said at the beginning of this on page 1, or the AMC potato that wouldn't die. And what that meant was, right after I had bought this car, there had been I had been at the plant and there had been some problems where they were breaking these badges and there were a bunch of broken badges on a desk. And I realized Toyota almost could spell potato if you switched them around. And at the time we were selling a right-hand drive Camry wagon in Japan that was made at our plant in Kentucky called the Scepter. So I grabbed a Scepter badge out of the trash and a Toyota badge, and I became the potato. And then in 95, Toyota launched this style of lower deck lid panel, and it said Camry. And right off the bat, some of them had letters that fell off. And I thought, oh, I know what I'll do. It'll be an AMC potato. Remember, AMC had gone out of business right before this, been bought by Chrysler. So it was just me being cheeky. But it became kind of famous as the years went by. People would know my car as the AMC potato. So when I restored it, I thought, okay, I'm definitely going to keep that. The problem was I could get a brand new Toyota badge and a new Camry letters, and my old original P was still in good shape, but the SE letters had completely worn out and they were not available anywhere. And this font had never been used again by Toyota, as far as I could tell. And then one day I was at a traffic light and I saw an ES300 and I realized where Kelty, our styling studio, got the letters from. So for about $10, I got an ES300 badge and boom, I was in progress. Oh, by the way, it costs. That's the original name of Scotland, where my ancestors come from. Anyone who's had a car that's really old has had occasion where some of the things in the door don't work anymore. And so these are the broken wires in my door harness. And so I did a little project to repair them and, put it back to original. And then electrically, the other thing, I added a subwoofer in the spare tire. And then I got a JBL audio system from a late model Camry that was designed for the Camry cabin, and then made these jumpers so I could connect it to my system. And I had to put together the wire harness of my car, the wire harness of its donor car, and make these jumpers correctly. And it was a real project. Anyway, so that all works beautifully now. It sounds fantastic. By the way, this is an original spare from 1992. I did throw it away. I wanted to keep it for sentimental reasons, but I realized it just wasn't safe. So it was just fun to get it in that one picture. Okay, the transmission. The reason I had to rebuild the transmission was I wanted to replace the seals. I didn't want it to leak anymore. And there's one seal that's only accessible after you pull out this gear train here. So there's no choice but to strip it all the way down. And this transmission is kind of a famous transmission in Toyota history. It turns out that it was also used in the supercharged Celica, the GT4. And that was used in WEC racing globally. So this transmission was homologated for racing. It has ports for an oil cooler. It has an oil pump built into it, which no manual transmission has ever had in history that I know of. Massively overbuilt differential. Anyway, so rebuilding it was really interesting. These gears are super beefy. And actually, Toyota realized the same thing. As soon as that racing series was over, they downgraded everything. The next generation of Camry to use this transmission, they really, this differential is like half as much. And then they used the same transmission in the RAV4, and all the gears are reduced in quite a bit in width because they didn't need that much. So this is a real super duper. After bead blasting the cases, it just looks absolutely gorgeous. And following the shop manual, I was able to rebuild it. So there's a brand new manual transmission. Like I said, it was used in a whole bunch of different cars, used in the MR2, and so on and so on. But because it was used in all those different cars, you'll see I got into it. I got into trouble at the end. I'll tell you about that in a second. One word of warning that I learned through this project, and that is I got to scroll back up here several pages to here, half shafts. Your car, these flexible boots on here, eventually they dry out and they crack and they need to be replaced. You can buy a set of boots for about 20 bucks per side from the dealer, and it's a messy project, but you can reboot these things and they'll keep going for almost forever. What most people do, like I did, was you just throw these OEM ones away and you buy really cheap aftermarket half shafts and throw them in and you think you're super smart. Well, what happened to me was I had 2 of those aftermarket El Cheapo half shafts fail on me. And one of them, when it failed, poked a hole in my transmission case. And I didn't even know it. I thought it was leaking because of old seals. It had a crack in it. And a good friend of mine welded it back up, so I was able to keep going. And that's a lesson learned. I'll never put aftermarket half shafts in a car anymore. I'll always, because each time a half shaft failed, that meant I had to get towed home. I had to pay for another half shaft and so on. Anyway, so that's all rebuilt. That's all good as new now. Hooray. Then all the engine parts. Anyone who knows manual transmissions, you might remember around the 80s, manual transmissions gained a little thing that held the throttle open when you would go to shift gears, kind of annoying. That's to keep the air flowing so that the exhaust is cleaner when you close the throttle real quickly to shift gears. Well, I used a throttle body from an automatic transmission and got rid of that little thing. So now the throttle actually closes the way I want it to when I shift. The rest of the engine parts, ceramic coated the exhaust headers, manifolds, and then the engine. So it's funny, I had these 2 engines. The one from the donor car looked gorgeous and mine looked like a lump of crud. Inside, mine was really healthy and this really pretty one had been very poorly cared for. So I used basically my parts for everything. Rebuilt it. And luckily, a guy who's the auto shop teacher at a local high school has an amazing shop that he teaches the kids in, far better than what I had when I was in high school. He's a former master tech from Toyota, and he does race engines for people. And so I hired him during COVID. The 2 of us built the long block together. This was the one, besides painting the body shell, this is the only other part of the project I had someone else help me with. So here's the long block almost completed before we brought it home to my house to finish up. It's just pretty pictures of a newly rebuilt engine. If you ever need to change a timing belt, binder clips are the ultimate secret to doing the job, making it super easy. Kenneth, the shop teacher, taught me that. He said this is his secret weapon when he's doing timing belt changes. Okay, so that's the rebuilt engine. And like I said, Kenneth Lewis helped me. He was amazing. The only thing the engine needed was bearings, gaskets, hoses, piston rings. We polished the crank. And that was it. Everything else was like new. Same thing with the transmission. Going back to that, as I was rebuilding this, I was expecting to replace bearings and synchros and all kinds of stuff. 200,000 miles on this transmission, everything measured to original factory specs. Actually, except for one thing, these little thrust washers here, they were the one part that was worn in the engine or the transmission that needed to be replaced. Just astonishing how well these things were built or overbuilt. So here's the completed unit. After I married the transmission to it, put on the drunken octopus, which is the wire harness that wraps around it from all sides. And then I lifted the body shell up, wheeled the engine's on a little dolly here that I made, wheeled it underneath, lowered the body down onto it, and then plugged everything in. And it started on the first turn of the key, believe it or not. I mean, people talk about that, but I mean, it was just like that. Just amazing for me to experience that. I was so happy. Here's the trick. That transmission I said was used in all these different models. The Camry was the one model that also had the V6. All of the other ones were 4 cylinders. And I thought I could use the engine mount from the automatic, the donor vehicle, but it would put the center line of the right-hand drive shaft in the wrong place by 3 millimeters. So at the last minute, when I thought I was all done, I was ready to put the half shafts in and fill it with oil and start it up. I had to wait almost a month while I looked around the world for another one of these engine mounts. Mine had been so badly rusted, I actually had to cut it with a die grinder to get it off to start the restoration project. But I was able to find a guy in Colorado that had them, and he sold me one, and I was back in business and was able to finish the project. Luckily, that was the scariest of all the near misses on the project. Everything else went much smoother. So there's my new Camry next to my new MG Midget. Checked everything out before I started it, and then put the bumpers and finished it up. I also reproduced all the labels. Found a guy who does that and was able to get all new labels to make it look truly factory. Even the little VIN stickers they used to put on. And here it is. So like I said, it was actually anticlimactic when I was done. It just started and ran. When I rebuilt the Midget both times, it was, just one thing after another, trying to get it to run right. And then anyone who's ever rebuilt a car before knows, or done a lot of work on one, you get loose bolts. Even though I used a torque wrench for everything, it's funny how after the first couple 100 miles, you just find loose stuff all over the place. Tighten them up and then you're good forever. Nothing really big here, just a couple of items I had when I was going through my final steps. And let me see, is there anything else I wanted to bore you with? Showed you the movie of the sports car. Yeah, it's my favorite part. All right, that's everything I have. Guys have any questions? Oh, you're muted. Oh, I can't hear anybody.
We are. Go for it, man.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Good. Just curious, any rough estimate as the number of hours you spent on this?
It took a little over 2 years. I actually sent, when we had the MYF reunion up at Speculator in September of 2018, I went to the Speculator library to scan and send the purchase paperwork for that donor car in Washington. And then it was shipped by truck to, by transport to eventually make its way to my house. So I started in September of 2018 and I finished in July of 2021. So that's just a little, I guess that's almost 3 years. So how many hours? All of them, I guess. I mean, there were several, I mean, there were months when I didn't work on it. Both winters for the whole ski season, I really didn't touch it because I had other things. And then one summer when I was trying to figure out that air conditioning project to swap from R12 to R134A, I took off probably almost 4 months because this really had me confused. And by the way, it works amazingly now. The new evaporator is 12% larger than the old one. So the fact that the new molecule is a little bit less efficient is more than made up for.
Okay, further questions?
Yes, a lot of restorations going on. I was just going to comment that the Union Pacific Railroad paid for the restoration of their largest steam engine, and it cost twice as much as the original engine did. So putting all these out, I mean, I really admire what you're doing, but getting the right parts, I think a lot of cases, you have to rebuild the parts. So I think for those of us here, there's a cautionary tale. But if you're interested, I know it's really enjoyable. I have a friend who's restoring farm tractors. He'd be interesting to talk to. Thanks, just a comment.
Other questions? Yes, okay.
Now, what tells me you're in Michigan?
Yeah.
Are the inspection laws similar to what we have in New York State, where you cannot get the vehicle inspected if you've got an engine in it that was not available at the time of production?
In Ann Arbor, there's no, actually in Michigan, there's no inspections at all. One of the things that's really shocked me when I moved here back in '85 was, in New York, the likelihood of seeing a car abandoned on the side of the road, like somebody couldn't get home last night and they had to call a friend because something was broken, and of burnout headlights and taillights in New York is relatively rare. Growing up, at least, it seemed that way. And I got to Michigan and I saw those things everywhere. I'd see brand new cars on the side of the road. Somebody broke down last night and had to be given a ride home. Lots of burnout lights. And so that right there is a big difference. Then in Ann Arbor, there's no emissions check, but there are checks in certain cities around Michigan. But in that case, they look at what are your emissions, and there's a certain age of car. I think I forget how many years it is, 20 years or something, in which case you can be exempt.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And since I used the original engine, there would be no question in this case.
Any other questions?
Just about the comments, I once restored a 1938 Rover, and I got the last half shaft in the world.
Nice. Nice.
Literally or figuratively?
Guess this question is, what were you thinking? Now, I've had a Camry, I've had a RAV4, I love both of them.
Mm-hmm.
What was your passion for a Camry? Toyota makes some very cool cars like the MR2 and
Yep.
things like that. Was this a sentimental favorite, or what were you thinking?
It's like they say, life coaches say, don't worry about what your passion is. Don't try to look for what your passion is for your career. Find something that needs doing that you can do, and let that become your passion. And then that's, you know, what they say people who are the happiest in their careers do. They usually end up in something they had no idea that they would end up in. This car was exactly the same for me as that. I had no expectation to keep this car. When I got it, it was just another lease car for work. I was just going to keep it for a couple of years, then move on to the newer, better thing. And it grew on me over time. It was a manual with a V6, which meant that it had a lot of power and it was lightweight. And as the next generations of Camrys, for instance, came along, they never matched the power to weight ratio that this one had. So I would kind of hold out. Or a Corolla would come along, but it was a little too small or the seat wouldn't fit me right. So I would wait a little bit longer. The IS 300 came out and I was pretty excited about that, but at first it wasn't available with a manual. So one thing led to another, and next thing I knew, I realized I'd owned this car for half my life, and it was only because it was good enough. So when I decided to restore it, unlike most stories where people go to restore something and they pay, 5 times what it's worth, in this case, I did my own labor and I needed to buy very few parts. I got the body shell for less than $2,000. And it came with a ton of stuff that I used. And like I said, the engine and the transmission, they only needed a couple of parts. The transmission, I needed these little bearings, the engine, piston rings, and gaskets and seals. And the rest of it was elbow grease and paint, really. Put everything back together. So it was reasonably cost effective, let's put it that way. I think it was about 40 grand all in.
Okay, any other questions? Great, another round of applause for our speaker. Thank you very much, Mark.
Thanks for having me, folks. I appreciate it. It was fun.
Thank you.
Well, good. Any other announcements or comments or? We're a little early, but. Get off.
Yeah.